Hey, Miguel Literati here with the Lights Out podcast. And I have one of our tributes, something that, we put a lot of dedication into. I don't like doing them at all. And the MMA world recently lost Brian Gassaway, a real veteran, a real first generation fighter, a guy who fought in the mid 90s the first time. And he was fighting all the way through 2010, 50 Fight Club member, very respected, especially in the Midwest scene, and an unsung hero of the sport, a guy who never made the UFC and stuff, but I guarantee you almost all of his opponents will remember him and will consider him a real veteran. I have the honor of having Gary Myers join us. I knew Gary had worked with Brian in the very beginning days, and Gary always takes it a step further, got Wes Gassaway, his older brother, and another MMA veteran from the old days, someone not to be messed with in the 1990s for sure. And I have the honor of having Wes's brother here for a little tribute to Brian. This is something that we're just going to talk about him and just share some memories and have some fun. Gary and Wes, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gary, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you came across the Gassaway brothers? I know that Phyllis Lee was a shared manager, but in 1996, why don't you give me a little bit of a flashback and we'll just go from there. And I'm done talking. I'm going to leave it to you two guys.
So I first, I'm speculating, Wes, this is 96, because I got on pay-per-view in November of 95. And Phyllis, me and my wife had just got an apartment in down by Greenwood, Indiana, stop 11 and 31. And she had called me and said, can you have Wes come on down and everything? You came down, stayed the night. You were very respectful. You reminded me of a monk back then because you didn't drink. I drank, I partied, and I trained, and you were everything that I wasn't. Like you were very quiet. I remember that going, this guy's quiet. I don't know. So and then you stayed at my apartment back in, and then your brother ended up staying in a new house I built. Him and Shoney actually lived upstairs, and I had these little 2 beds I put out for those guys in a room, and they stayed in there. But the reason I thought you started first, because I saw you first. You were the first one to come to my apartment down there when I moved down there.
Yeah.
And we got to train with Jason Gotzi and some of his crew, and Goddard, or the guy that owned the gym. But I remember you were very respectful, and because you're coming down, I don't know you, so my lasting memory of you is just being a very respectful athlete, right? And I'm sure you went on to absorb as much fighting as you could, how to do things or whatever, after you came to my house at that time. And but I ended up seeing your brother, and he was the same way as you were. I mean, very respectful. So I had a lot of respect for both of you and your careers. Now, I don't know if Miguel, you said something about Brian not fighting the UFC or Wesley, but I know Brian did have a fight in the UFC, didn't he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I may have been mixing it up, and I defer to your knowledge on that. Wes, why don't you tell us how you got to Gary? Because Gary also mentioned Shoney Carter, another legendary Midwest figure. And I know that we're talking about, now we're in the world of fights that are not on the databases, fights that, went down weekend after weekend after weekend. Shoney, Brian, yourself, all part of that. Why don't you talk about your initiation, then hooking up with like pros like Gary and other people later? Why don't you take us through that?
Yeah. We got started, Brian and I were from a small town in Ohio called Urbana, Ohio. And we actually grew up in a rural school out there called St. Paris Graham. So St. Paris Graham's kind of famous because it's one of the best wrestling high schools in the country. And we both wrestled there. And what ended up happening is that we saw an early UFC. We saw UFC. I think the first one we saw was 2, and then maybe 3. And then we saw the fight where Gary fought Conan.
Yeah.
And we saw that on a pay-per-view. And we're kind of picking up these fights and watching those, and we're really kind of excited because back in those days, I mean, the whole idea, there used to be movies about, okay, we're going to get this guy in a ring and that guy in a ring, this style versus that style. Right. That was all movie stuff. It was all fiction, right?
Right.
And then next thing you know, it's happening in real life. And so that was pretty exciting stuff. And, Brian and I, we loved watching the old karate movies on Saturday mornings and Saturdays afternoons and stuff. And so when this starts happening in real life, we're both pretty excited about this, the prospect of it, right? Yeah. So we ended up catching some of those very early events. And at that time, I think they called it no holds barred. I don't think they even called it MMA back then. It was no holds barred. We caught some of those events, and we were just pretty excited about it. And we ended up having a guy who trained in the area who had fought in one of the UFCs. He was on the undercard, named Jack McLaughlin. Yeah. And he was in the area, and he trained at a place right there in Urbana. So we found out about it, contacted the dojo there, and it was a deal where it was cool. You could come, you could train. You didn't have to pay anything. But the deal was you couldn't miss a lesson. If you missed a lesson, you were out. So we started going there right off the bat and training. And we're literally training on concrete floors with carpet on them, and we're doing our full throws and just a whole no holds bar style fighting on concrete floors with carpet. So it was real interesting because we came from a wrestling background, but we had to learn to adapt to move across the floor without dragging our knees or dragging the tops of our feet, because we kept ripping skin off. Yeah. So
unbelievable.
So we're doing this, and we trained there for about 6 months, and we didn't really give it much thought. But then the person who had brought Jack to the UFC, Phyllis Lee, contacted us and said, "Hey, I heard you guys are down there and you guys are rolling around, and would you be interested in maybe doing some pro wrestling?" And we weren't really interested in that. But she says, "Well, if you do pro wrestling first, you can build a name up, and then," or actually she goes, "Do you want to do MMA?" And she goes, "If you do MMA first, you can get into pro wrestling. It builds up a name, that sort of thing." And we're just like, well, we don't know about all that. We're just kind of training, having fun. But there was a school up in Lima, Ohio that was run by Al Snow.
Yeah.
Who was a pro wrestler.
Sever's Corner.
Yes. Yeah. So he's a pro wrestler, but he's also a shooter from back in the day. Mm-hmm. So he does know his stuff. So we go up there, we do a little demonstration for Phyllis. She likes it. And and then at that point she says, "Well, hey, let's maybe sign some contracts and see what we can get to happen." So what ended up happening is that we ended up going to an event called the IFC, and Brian, I believe, fought in IFC number 2, International Fighting Championship. Mm-hmm. And he went out, and his first time out, it was back in these days, this was with the tournaments, right? So you had 3 fights in a night, an 8-man tournament bracket. And he ended up getting runner-up in that tournament. And so he was off to the races with that at that point. He loved that stuff. And then about 2 months later, I ended up going out and doing it myself, and I ended up actually winning one of the tournaments very early on. So that's kind of how we got started. But Phyllis kind of she knew we were down there. We were out there rolling. We were rolling with a former UFC veteran, and she just sort of brought us into it.
See, now just describe your younger brother, like compared to yourself, people who might be meeting you for the first time, compare him to demeanor and stuff. You're older, but you said right from the start, like he tried it first and things. So maybe give him a little bit of a description of his personality for the people out there. Was he gung ho? Was he like drinking it up, or was he studious? Give us an insight.
Brian was a fighter. He just, there's different types, I think, of MMA fighters, and I think he's more of the archetype that you think of when you think of an MMA fighter. He he loved the physical conflict. He loved the challenge of it, and loved getting into that ring and just throwing it all into it. So he was just from the jump, he was all about getting in there and just mixing it up. He really had a passion for it. He jumped into it right away. I mean, I was more reserved about it because I thought, well, like I said, I mean, he saw the fights and thought they were just incredible. I was like, well, that's really cool, but man, those guys are nuts, because you're just in there just throwing down, because it's the real deal, as opposed to the pro wrestling and the fake stuff that was going on back in those days. The fake movies and stuff. And I think the blood sport movies and stuff like that, where they would talk about it, but it was all crap. So
right. So Wes, I used to say, when we started fighting, it was more about bringing, because there was this age-old thing about bringing styles together to see what was the best style. That's why I refused to learn jiu-jitsu in the beginning. I didn't want to learn it because, that thing stuck in my head. What's the best style? So I kept to my wrestling for a couple of years. But as I said before on the podcast, I knew I had to go all in or I wouldn't be successful at all, right? Because it's going to evolve quickly.
Yeah.
So that's what, to your point of how this thing was, like, who's the best style in the beginning. Now you got to cross train into everything.
Yeah, back in those days, we were trying to figure out what was it all about, because no one knew. It just sort of it fell out of the sky, and we didn't, no one knew what was going on.
Right in your lap.
Yeah, figuring out. So it was really funny, because back in those days, those early days, again, I go back to the movies that you saw on Saturday afternoon, and we would watch some of that stuff, and we would train like that. It was crazy. So we would go out there and we'd be out there kicking trees and running running bamboo dowels up and down our legs to try to toughen our shins up, and doing the stuff where you kind of stand there and just let someone just hit you, punch you in the stomach, punch you in the thigh, kick you in the thighs and the bodies, just that sort of body conditioning to get used to the impact of blows, because again, this was so new, no one knew what it was all about, so we had to kind of figure it out. I mean, people understood boxing, but this was a whole new deal with, you're going to be able to throw an elbow or a knee or headbutts for that matter, because it was pretty wild back in the early days. So we had to kind of adapt ourselves and adapt our bodies to these impacts that people just simply weren't used to.
Now how much did you and Brian train together, and when did you stop training with him?
We trained together. I think if I recall, I think it was we started in about January of '97, I believe.
You both fought in '96, so call it January.
What was it, '96? Okay.
Yeah, you both debuted in late '96.
Okay, then when it went January of '96, then that we started training.
Okay.
But again, you have to keep in mind that we had an athletic background up till that point. Also, we'd wrestle.
Talk about Brian's athletic background.
Well, Brian, he was an all-around athlete. So he we played baseball, we played soccer, football, track, wrestling. We did everything, and then from there, as we got older, that's when we started to get more into the martial arts. So we were taking more traditional style martial arts, like for example, we took something called Kaju Kimbo, which is like a Hawaiian martial art. It was a hybrid martial art for the time, what you consider a hybrid martial art today, but it was a mix of several arts. So we would train stuff like that, and Brian was always a great athlete, and we started off that way. But then as the martial arts started to come along, I mean, that was where the passion was. I mean, he was a great athlete and all, but the martial arts is just what really lit that fire under him, and that became the passion of his life. I mean, it's real interesting with Brian, because before we flipped into martial arts, we were both professional musicians, and Brian was an incredibly talented musician.
What instrument did you play?
He played guitar.
Okay.
He was mainly a guitar player, but he played bass. He could play drums, but he was a guitar player and a singer, and he was oh, he was an incredible singer. He had a 5-octave range, which, if anyone knows anything about music, I mean, that the most elite singers in the world, some of them don't have a 5-octave range. So he was an incredible singer, and he played guitar. He was a really good guitar player. But then when the martial art, when the MMA came on, when the No Holds Barred came on, that was it. He just dropped it. Like he was professional at the time. He'd go out and he'd play gigs and get money. And as soon as No Holds Barred came out, that was done.
Dude, you're not allowed mixed martial arts to stop a career as music.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, they're both show business at the end of the day, and it's hard to make it in both, But
Right.
Talk a little bit about some of those early days. I know that you guys have ties to Shoney Carter, who's a legend in the Midwest, and a lot of his bar fights and stuff are now out there in stories. But I know that you guys were right there with him for some of those, like, 3 fights in one night and, picking people out of the audience. Steve, do you have any Brian stories from those days that come to mind right off in this trying circumstances? So.
Yeah, so there was a club in Chicago called the Tropicana.
Yes, that's it.
Yes. And,
I had Journey, and you guys had Tropicana.
Yes. So Brian was up there, and he was one of the house guys at the place. So he hooked up with Shoney, and I believe Shoney was a house champion there. And he kind of hooked up with Shoney, and then he started working there. So he was the guy who he kind of worked behind a bar a little bit. He'd work as a bouncer, and then he'd call him up into the ring to fight. So that was sort of where he started cutting his teeth onto that also. And that was real interesting stuff, because the fights were just wild back then, because it was in a boxing ring, and they would pull people. It was a challenge thing. Who wants to come up here and do it? And
it didn't matter what weight they were.
It didn't matter. There was no weight classes. There weren't really even time limits to it at that point. You just, who's going to come up, and let's get it on.
Yeah.
So they were just wild fights back in those days. And one of the fight that Brian talks about that was his the craziest situation is that he's up there in the ring. They're issuing the challenge, and some guy comes up and says, "Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll fight you." And this guy Brian's 6'1". Okay. And this guy might've been like 5'5". He kind of walks up. "Yeah, I'll go ahead and take you on," and all this stuff. And this guy's talking a whole bunch of shit. And they go, "Okay." So they, let's go back in the room, and let's get gloved up. Let's prep for this, and let's go out here and let's do this thing. So Brian's in the ring waiting for this guy to come out. And then he comes out, but he comes out with his entourage. And then the guy who's ends up wanting to fight Brian, the guy was actually, it was a sandbag job. So the guy's fighting Brian tall enough, he steps over the top rope, and steps into the ring, and he's ready to fight. And the Brian looks up, and he's just like, "Okay, I guess this is what it is."
Wow.
Wow. So it was a complete sandbag job. And this guy, was, gosh, know how tall and how much he outweighed Brian, but Brian was always game for a fight. So it's like, "Okay, let's do this." And they go ahead and they rock and roll. And the fight, back in those days, we didn't have rounds, we didn't have breaks. And, about 40 minutes later, he beats this guy. 40 minutes straight, he ended up taking this guy out.
Wow.
And what was that payday like for him, dude?
Back in those days, it wasn't about the pay. It was about the crime.
I got you.
A couple free beers, right?
Yeah. So, sometimes you got paid, sometimes you didn't. Sometimes there'd be house money, there'd be betting going on, but it wasn't really about the purse.
Right.
Now, the fact of the matter is that especially for the time, I feel like that was very good experience, because what you're actually short is real combat experience, real fight. That's what you're looking for. So, you start racking up that stuff. It makes you a very dangerous guy in experience. But when did you realize Brian was even better than that? Like when he started to go to Japan and Phyllis, like when did you realize that this guy, was taking it to a new level?
Well, I mean, it really started there with him. I mean, he had that talent from very early on, and he just had that drive from the very beginning. So you knew that you knew that was going somewhere because it was just that passion. He wasn't going to. There was nothing going. He wasn't going to stop. He was just going to keep going and going until he couldn't go on anymore. So
he had a nice little win streak over there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, more than most people I know. Me and Gotsy, Lido, we've all been there fighting. He'd had a nice little lick there.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, so I mean that was the deal then. So you just kind of threw down, and like I said, some of those record, those aren't they're not on the record as official fights, but they were fights.
Yeah.
They threw down.
No, they register him the pancreas. I mean, I'm just saying he got a nice little, maybe a 10-fight roll there.
Yeah,
and it was a nice little roll because it's not easy fighting in Japan.
No. So then, so what ended up happening is that we ended up hooking up with Phyllis Lee, and then she got us into the IFC, then eventually into Pancrase, and just on from there.
Yeah. Was Buddy Elbin running the IFC then? Or who was running that?
Buddy Guy, maybe at that time. Was that Buddy Guy?
Well, there's a guy named Buddy Elbin, and he ran it. And then,
Buddy Albin. Okay,
yeah.
Buddy.
Yes. Because you guys fought New Orleans.
Yep.
And had a free fight. He lost to Macedo in the finals to like a leg hook, ankle hook. And
like
he had submitted 2 guys before that final match.
Yes.
And so him losing that fight, Anthony Macias, so he loses to a guy that's got some ring savvy, knows leg locks, and so it's a nice little tournament for him to get to the finals because I fought in the same building. I think you guys probably, I'm guessing, fought in the Pontchartrain Center. I'm not sure, but
I believe so. Yeah,
so I won a tournament there with Buddy Albin. They took his whole fight purse. Phyllis got me paid, but at the end he had a professional match going on, and the athletic commission took all the gate money, but I got paid. Wasn't much, like $12.50, but I got paid.
Yeah, I mean, back in those days, I mean, you might get paid, you might not get paid. So, and if you got paid, the guy who came in and cashed his check after, you may not get paid.
Right.
It was like
that's like the WEF. He said, "I'm gonna write you a check," and oh God, I take cash, no checks.
Yeah, exactly.
Amy Levine who said that. I'm gonna give you a check. I'm like, oh no, not a check.
Now, as you guys are talking about IFC, now you're talking about legendary shows from the 90s, and Brian has quite a few of those on his resume. Did you accompany him on trips to, like, for example, Super Brawl in Hawaii, where he took on J.R. Palmer, an early legend, similar level guy?
Yeah, I actually fought that night also. I ended up fighting that night. I think I fought Joe Charles that night.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember Joe. UFC
fighter. Yeah. So we both went to Hawaii, and Hawaii was just a wild scene back in those
Loved
days.
it. I fought there. Loved it.
Just a lot of fun, but just wild.
Yeah.
And,
one thing about Hawaii was there was a little unwritten rule there, man. You didn't mess around in that town. You followed the rules of these unwritten street rules, or it wasn't going to be good for you.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had encounters in Hawaii that if you they would talk about, what would they say? They'd say we'll go out to the beach. What they meant is they were going to drop you in the beach or drop you off in the ocean out there.
Yeah. So, I was warned of that. I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, I just got to the bar.
Exactly.
But the rest of the night, I was watching my back.
Oh yeah, wild times. But we went out to Hawaii and fought Super Brawl. Was a lot of fun, and just various events. But Brian was he stayed busy. I enjoyed it, but to me is a matter of, like, if you don't make enough money, it's just not. Is it worth it versus the money we're making? Brian didn't care about the money. He was about that fight, so it didn't matter if you're paying him $1,000, if you paid him $10,000, it didn't make a difference to him. He was all about it. He would have done it for free.
Wes, you guys had to talk a lot about on the phone from Chicago to where you were at. I bet he slept on more couches than more dojo floors. I think he at Bob Shermer's, he probably slept on that mat more nights than any athlete I know.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that was pure dedication.
Now that's all very heads over to we talked with Chris Lytle, we talked with a lot of fighters, Gary, and back then the UFC really wasn't that big a deal in the 97. I mean, it was on pay-per-view and you liked it and stuff, but the big deal was really getting to Japan. And he went to Japan early in Pancrase. How did you guys feel about that? You seem like, hardworking Midwest American guy. Like, did you ever picture you be getting off the plane in Tokyo like 5 years before? Like, how was that about? Experience?
That was the craziest thing. It was absolutely mind blowing because, growing up like that in Ohio in the Midwest, a small town, I don't think we even really imagined the idea of international travel, and then let alone competing and being on pay-per-views around the world. It was just, it wasn't a part of the concept. It was so far out there that you didn't dream about it because who knew to dream like that?
Yeah, exactly.
It happened. It's your life. It's your brother's life. It happened.
But it did happen. It's one of those things. I think just the willingness to take chances and to extend yourself beyond what most people will extend themselves. I mean, I look at martial artists. I look at fighters. I mean, we're built different than most people because we're willing to take those risks and willing to risk it all and just do things that other people aren't willing to do. And then you end up in situations that you can never imagine because you're just willing to take those risks. So end up in Japan. It was just incredible because we'd seen a Pancrase fight. And like I said, but the rules, of course, for Pancrase back in those days was very different than the MMA rules. I mean, it was similar, but it was different. So you had
what is deadly?
Oh, absolutely, it's deadly, and it made sense in some ways because you had the open hand strikes, and they made sense because in the Pancrase you might fight, then like a month later or 2 months later you're fighting again. And of course, like when you're doing straight MMA with the no holds bar style rules that were back in the day, you would get banged up so bad you couldn't fight. But the Pancrase was interesting because you might get banged up that bad, but you may not get banged up that bad, but you didn't necessarily hurt any less, but you wouldn't get cut necessarily.
Right.
MMA, you really risk getting cut. But in the Pancrase rules, you didn't have to worry about that so much. So you might be fighting, fight 1 month and 2 months later fighting again. But Japan was just a blast in the culture shock situation with that, because you roll in, you fly into Tokyo, and you don't speak the language, and you're trying to figure out how to eat. And one of the funniest things is that we're over there, and I had learned how to eat with chopsticks before I'd ever gone to Japan. It was just something I picked up along the way, but Brian didn't know how to do that. Yeah. And it was amazing because I'm sitting there laughing at him, but it took like a meal before he figured it out. He had to eat, so he figured it out very quickly. So you just the culture shock and the experience it really was quite something just to see. We were a small town in the Midwest. To go to and get to drop into Tokyo, it was mind blowing.
Yeah.
Now, and this is the part where, even for the old days, Brian really deserves credit for being an adaptable guy, because you're talking about what you guys are talking about there with Pancrase, with the shin guards and the open hand and stuff. You're talking about a real technique based, fighting system, and Brian did very well. And then you turn around and, like, this was in the first half of 1997. And then you turn around and in September of 1997, your brother competes in the Brazil IVC #2. And this is real Vale Tudo, real no holds barred. Talk about going to Brazil and taking part in that. He fought a guy, Sombra de Noite, who is going to be forgotten, but another guy, a ripped athlete who probably had as many bar fights and that type of fights as you guys there. This guy, you look on Sherdog, you will not be impressed. But this guy, I met him. He's a scary dude, man. What? Go over that, the culture shock of going from Japan to Brazil, and then return to Ohio.
Well, yeah, well, that's crazy stuff. I mean, Brazil is a different world than Japan. Japan, a very old culture, the old warrior code, and
That's you, dude. That's you.
Yeah. But you fly into there, and it's a very structured situation. Brazil was just wild.
Yeah.
Just it's the polar opposite of what Japan was. So
Right.
you fly into Brazil, and it's just an incredible situation, but scary, but exciting.
I fought there twice. I know.
And I think the thing was, I mean, you go into the ring there, and like I said, you get in the ring, you're fighting. Of course, in those days, like the rules being looser than they are today.
Yeah.
And just the way that people move back then. So going into the ring, you're risking your life, but it wasn't necessarily your opponent that you're risking your life against. I mean, just getting back out the ring and back into the back. I mean, who knew what was going to happen?
Dude, I don't know. When I fought the IBC 5, they carried the doctor out of the arena because he called a fight, said stop the fight, and then the crowd carried him out, said you're out of here.
Absolutely.
You're not going to stop a fight.
Yeah, it's just an incredible situation. So, just very different than, just a small town Midwest USA to just get thrown into these incredible situations. But it's just one of those things that you just incorporate that into your experience. So it was just a lot of fun back in those days. It's just a blast, and it was all new. But the thing was, it wasn't just new for us; it was new for everybody.
Right.
It was a new world.
And you realize, Wesley, you experienced, and Brian experienced, Shoney and I experienced things that now nobody will experience. These new things of Pancras, of IVC, which is shut down. All these new things, IFC is shut down. All these things nobody will ever experience how we experience fighting. One atmosphere to another. It wasn't just fighting in the UFC. It was every organization you think of it. Everybody had a different way of doing things, and there was a different level of fighting. And we all lived that.
That's right. And back in those days, like we were saying earlier, I mean, it was the UFC wasn't necessarily the biggest organization in the world at that time, and they were all kind of. We just had to kind of see what was going to end up, rising above the rest. But it was a wild show. So just because you were the UFC champion, that had no bearing whether you're the best guy in the world. Nothing at all.
And fighting in different places paid more. And sometimes UFC, they were going to pay you $1,000. You're not making more overseas.
That's right. Well, that's why a lot of people jump to Japan, because in Japan, you just simply got paid more. It's a general rule. The American fighters, if you had any sort of success, you'd go to Japan.
Yeah. Now, and here's another, looking back at it, where Brian really doesn't get enough credit, because here he took off on the international level. He fought, in Hawaii, in Japan, and in Brazil. He took some losses there, but you could tell he came back with the experience, because after that, he goes on a winning streak that for the era is a very, very strong winning streak. Jason Nicholson was one tough Iowa, I think, Indian background man, a big, tough dude.
Yeah.
He started the winning streak there. In that winning streak, he beat Midwest kind of legends, John Rankin, Travis Fulton, beat Mark Hughes, Matt's brother. Joe Slick, an incredibly jiu-jitsu guy for the time being and stuff. This is a great winning streak that he had there, taking him through that era. And really, he's an unsung hero for that. At some point during that winning streak, I believe that you retired and he kept going. Talk about those moments. And, I'm sure that you obviously backed him for the remainder of his career and stuff as he, fought for another decade. But talk about those moments where you decided to leave the sport and he went on.
Well, like I said, he had an incredible passion for it. And it's simply what he wanted to do. And it was a compulsion for him. He had to. He was about that life and had to do that. At that point, I had gotten married and had a child, and I'm looking at, what do I want to do to go forward in my life, and the fighting. It's simply, back in those days, the pay was erratic, and it certainly is not what it was, even 10 years after that fact.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So fighters had to make choices back in those days, and they were hard choices if you're trying to make a living, because even back in those days, I mean, you had to train and fight full time if you wanted to have any sort of success. But even doing that, you didn't necessarily you weren't going to be able to make a living at it necessarily. So he was just simply about all that. So I dropped back and stopped fighting, and I went into different things. I ended up teaching and going into law enforcement, doing some other things in my life. And he just kept charging and kept going forward with the fighting. And so he was teaching, but he was about to fight.
Now, to clean up a little of my mistake from earlier, and Gary corrected me, he finally got to the UFC in the 2005 era. He competed at UFC 54 and took on Diego Sanchez. Did you accompany him for that? Is that what?
No, I did not. I was at home with our father watching the fight.
And what was Brian's story coming back from that experience? UFC 54 by then, you're talking about Zuffa owned, and 2005 is no longer, you're talking about sanctioning bodies and stuff. How was that experience for Brian?
Well, he loved that. He loved getting on and by that time, the UFC had separated itself out from the other organization. So it was the biggest stage in the world. So he loved that experience. The international profile and stuff, it was just a great time for me. He certainly enjoyed it. But for him, the big stage, the small stage, it didn't matter. It was about getting in the ring and facing the person across from you. The UFC was a pretty interesting fight, because he got into the ring, and he had one strategy going into the ring, and then he gets in the ring and he just completely changes his strategy, which it didn't work. He didn't win. It didn't quite work out, but he had a strategy that then he just like, well, his initial strategy was to use distance and movement and stay away and stay on the outside. But then he's like, yeah, I just think I'm just going to catch him when he shoots on me. So he just changed his strategy on the spot, and no one that was even there. I mean, they trained one way, they had a strategy, then it's like, yeah, I'm going to switch it up now. So
it reminds me what Tyson says: you have a plan until you hit in the face, right?
Exactly.
Now, Miguel, wasn't that a main event in the UFC, like a fight night or something?
I mean, against Diego Sanchez, this is UFC 54 boiling point. I think that's gonna be a pay-per-view when I check. The main event was Chuck Liddell and Jeremy Horn.
Okay.
But he was on what would be called the main card. He was on the pay-per-view taking on Diego Sanchez, who came obviously to the TV.
Diego, I think, had just won the Ultimate, or the show, The Ultimate Fighter.
Yeah, exactly.
And Diego had just won that, so that was Diego's debut into the professional card.
Now, can you give us some insight? Why was that Brian's real only shot at the UFC? I mean, Diego was a big name. Obviously, they're bringing him in, as the B side, but he had a good performance into the second round. What went on? What went on in the thinking of the UFC, or what kept him away from them again?
I back in those days, you didn't have to have a couple fight losing streak to be in or to be out. I mean, you could just be out immediately. What was interesting, though, is that there was one point where the Ultimate Fighter was sort of a very new thing, and what ended up happening at one point is, I think when Diego's Ultimate Fighting show, it was one of the very early ones. I don't know if it was.
I think it was number one. It was. He won the first season.
Yeah, so it was very early on, and then later on, and it wasn't much later on though, they held basically a casting call for another version of Ultimate Fighter, and at that time Brian was looking for some fights, and he ended up contacting the UFC, and he ended up talking to Dana White directly, but they'd already filled all the slots for the show, and he's like, man, if I'd realized that if you wanted to do this, I would have got you in, but they just simply didn't have enough spots in the show that he was looking to get on. He got in too late. But in those days, though, it didn't take. I mean, again, it was even though they were more established at that point, it wasn't the organization that it is today, and so the protocols of who was in and who was out, they were a little different back then than they are today. So, I imagine with his performance in the fight against Diego. In that first fight, because he, if I remember correctly, his fight was the longest fight that Diego had. I mean, he lasted longer than any other people on the TV show, and so I imagine the protocols. He probably would have at least had a second shot, another fight in the UFC, if given the protocols of today versus back then.
Yeah.
Now I'm looking through his record there, and after that, still fighting tough guys. Another memorable fight that he had in a fight that, you know, if it had gone the normal way and Brian gotten a win, would have been a real feather in his cap. And it ended with an ugly injury. If I remember, it was with Pele, the Brazilian, Jose Landy. And talk about that experience for Brian, because, you know, sometimes when a guy gets hurt like that in front of you, you know, it has, you start thinking about it. He was older and a little bit more mature, maybe not as gung-ho at that point. Do you remember talking to Brian about that fight?
Well, I think, you know, you get into the ring to compete and to test yourself, and you do want to win and you do want to dominate. And I think in some ways, if winning and victory takes hurting the opponent to win, that's one thing, but an injury is a whole different thing. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to injure your opponent. And so that, it's one of those things, and that was a pretty horrific break on the leg with that. And you see something like that, and it's something that you certainly
doesn't leave your mind, does it?
Yeah. I mean, it's when you see something, even watching it on TV. I mean, if you watch it, you go, oh, you shake and kind of look at it. When you see it, it's horrific. You know, when you feel it against your leg, you know, it has definitely an effect on you. But I don't think it necessarily discourages them from fighting, but it makes you think about fighting a little differently. Because again, like I say, we're in there and we're fighting, and like I say, you understand when you're in the ring that you truly are risking. You know, you're taking a risk being in there, and you understand that. But you know, out of 100 fights, out of 1,000 fights, how many breaks have you seen like that? Not, you know, but when it happens, you happen to be the one there where it happens with. It definitely makes an impact on you.
So I can tell you guys that Pele is one of my all-time favorite fighters. Only because of his fighting spirit. I've had a lot of interactions with him. But when you think of MMA fighters, he has to be, in your mind, a guy that epitomes MMA. And so a win over that guy, you know, I mean, even to get in the ring with that guy, I'm not even sure that I'm thinking, look, I'm going to be in incredible shape. I'm going to be the best of that. I'm going to be the best that night. Brian takes that fight. He has to know in his mind all these things have to be on point, because Pele is no joke.
For sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you know, and his performance. I mean, even before the break, I mean, if you look at the fight, I mean, he was winning the fight anyways. He was you know, a lot of that fight was on their feet, and Brian was just landing. He was landing so many overhand rights in that fight. He was lighting Pele up pretty good.
Pele was a craftsman. I mean, he was I mean, good for Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. But he also stated later too, I mean, those kicks that Pele was throwing, they were just the hardest kicks he's ever felt in the ring. Mm-hmm. They were incredible.
So, and now that fight occurred in 2008, and he ended his career in 2010. One of the other curiosities here is he did get a chance in Bellator, which, you know, in 2010 was already pretty firmly like the number 2 company. Bellator 25, and he scored a win and then didn't go back to Bellator. Is there, you know, something there, or was he already nearing the end because he fought one time after that?
I think he was probably winding down at that point. He'd had many years at it and was getting a little older. I didn't really hear, you know, what the thinking was at that point, but I just, you know, I suspect that, you know, it was just starting to wind down a little bit for him at that point.
Yeah. Well, you know, we're coming near the end of like the retrospective part of his career. I think, you know, we've drawn a pretty good picture of a guy who was a competitor, a guy I think we, you know, I could sum it up as, even if the UFC hadn't gotten on pay-per-view and it hadn't blown up the sport, I think he would have been doing it anyway all along. Is that a fair characterization?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it didn't matter where it was; he would have done it. I mean, heck, you know, he'd throw down in a ring in a bar, you know, just
Yeah.
you know,
I know that one.
it made no difference where it was. He was about that life.
Now, one of the things as we wrap up here, obviously, you know, it is a remembrance, and I know that the family has a GoFundMe page that they're using to raise funds and help with, you know, moving on and going forward with this. Why don't you plug, you know, that page and give some information about that, so, you know, if anybody out there wants to contribute, they can jump aboard.
Well, actually, that GoFundMe page was set up by the person that he had a business. He had the Chicago MMA, so he had a partnership with a business there, and the business partner had set that GoFundMe up for him.
Okay.
So
It's up to about $17,448 right now.
Is that where it's at today?
Yeah. They're trying to raise 20 grand before I got on here because I was going to donate some money. I was looking at it, and
so it's getting close to the goal there.
Yes, and it will be.
You know, I think, you know, not to be crass, because this is a situation where you don't want to turn a tragedy into where, you know, you're asking for money and stuff, but I think this is a real nice spot for old school MMA fans to contribute. I don't think, you know, there's no retirement funds or anything like that, but I think, you know, this is the end in a situation, and it's a place where you can really show a little bit of support for guys that really gave it to us, you know, all in the ring. And I think Brian qualifies as that, a guy with, you know, he's a 50 fight club member. We have a 50 fight club here. He had well over 50, you know, professional fights, not counting about the bar fights and stuff. And definitely, you know, hopefully everything is, the money's used for, you know, expenses and things, but isn't really direly needed. And if it's not direly needed, I know Brian didn't make his money from MMA doing it. So here's a chance for the business and the sport to give back a little bit to a guy who gave everything he could to us in the ring. And, you know, I think that's a nice spot for Brian. I'll have some links and things here in the spot. Wes, I'm going to give you the final words, and then we'll cut it off here. I want to thank you very much for joining us. I know, obviously, you know, your mind must be, you know, filled with emotions going through the whole range of things. Just to join us and spend this time with us is very important to the MMA community too. I thank you for answering the call to our, you know, our tribute here, because I think Brian's a special fighter that is going to, you know, go down as an unsung hero in the sport.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, and I think the thing is that, you know, after the fighting career, he transitioned into the teaching full time, and he had a passion. He had just as much passion for teaching as he did for fighting, and so there's lots of students of his out there who really have shown a lot of love for him. In these last couple of days here. So just, you know, the family and friends really do appreciate all the love that he's getting. And it's one of those things that people don't necessarily know what you think. You know, it's funny how you don't necessarily hear it while you're living, and it comes out when you pass. But nonetheless, though, he impacted many lives, and and the love that is flowing toward him as